I finally escaped from my cruel stepmom, but her shadow kept following me. When my mother died, I was 7 and small enough to fit in the crook of my father's elbow. The world tilted and patched itself with new names. Stepmom, new house, better now. They wrapped it in polite dinners and photo smiles. My father breathed relief. I learned to hold my breath. Her cruelty arrived slowly, like frost. It began as small exclusions. A plate slid to my brother's place at the table before my bowl was even considered. A book snatched away with a look that said I had no right to want anything. She never struck me in front of others. She learned, fast, the economy of shame, words, looks, the long silence that spoke louder than any slap. At home, she sharpened herself into a dictator of the smallest things. She called me clumsy, fragile, stupid, the lazy child my father felt sorry for. She compared me to my mother with relish, as if every memory of my mom were a ledger where I was always short. When I cried, she taught me the worst lesson of all, that I was the problem. My father, exhausted from grief and grateful for someone who kept appointments organized and the garden tidy, saw only what she wanted him to see. School was not rescue. I learned to fold myself into corners so teachers wouldn't notice the bruises of omission. I learned to answer questions in the smallest voice that held no complaint. I learned to present a plausible normal for the world and keep the rest like contraband beneath my ribs. The first time CPS visited our house, I was 12. A neighbor had called after seeing bruises on my younger stepbrother's arms. The caseworker came and took statements that sounded to me like fingers on a map tracing the cold route of our home life. For reasons I still don't understand, the system tried to remove me. They took us to separate foster homes. I went to a house that smelled of coffee and too bright sunlight. My father signed forms, cried a little, and then, after a week of the kind of normal I had never known, everything was reversed. Trauma bonds, the social worker said. My stepmom had woven a public performance of grief and contrition. She signed documents, smiled for the camera when friends came to visit. The foster placements were rough. New rules felt like magnifying glass rules. Anyone who asked me to join a group could later be the person who told me to be quiet. I acted out. I ran. I smashed a window when a host mother accused me of stealing soap. They could not understand the ache that had grown inside me, the way every attempt to receive care felt like a demand to repay an invisible debt. After 2 failed placements, CPS returned me and my brother to the house we'd fled. The system had failed us. Social bureaucracy had a hand in our return. When they handed me back, the stepmom pretended to hug me and whispered in my ear, "You belong here. Don't ever forget that." Being taken back broke something in me more permanently than the house ever had. I learned the exact cadence of her cruelty: public praise, private poison. My father stopped asking questions. Perhaps he did not want to know. Perhaps he could not see. I learned to swallow my panic and build around it a scaffold of acceptance. Yet the Vietnam of small violences accumulated. Teachers' notes turned into recitations of my poor manners. I was sent to therapy, only to be told by therapists that children like me needed structure more than sympathy. Each time a hand reached toward me with goodwill, I flinched and pulled away, because the idea of trust had been made into a riddle whose answer always hurt. The years inside that house taught me 2 things: how to vanish and how to observe. From the window of my small room, I watched the rhythm of my stepmother's life: meetings, volunteer hours, the way she flattered neighbors and courted church committees. She built an immaculate public life, and around it she cultivated private cruelty, the way a gardener might prune roses, precise, efficient, hidden behind polite signage. She loved the idea of control. I did not grow up wanting to hurt people. I grew up wanting to be unhurt. But wounds fester if you don't tend them, and when I left again, this time older, sharper, quieter, I left with the knowledge that my survival required action. I took a job that paid enough to rent a room in a town 3 bus routes away. I enrolled in night classes. I learned to answer the shadow with facts, medical reports, school records, the evidence of missed appointments and strange injuries. I started small. I gathered paper, records, names. The truths that had been easier for adults to ignore, and that had been used as tools for her performance of benevolence, could also be turned into testimony. I sat with social workers for hours, replaying moments until they stopped sounding like my imagination and began to sound like the pattern they were. I met other people who had been quietly crushed under the same thumb, neighbors with bruised kids, ex-friends who'd been cut out when they spoke. I found a lawyer who listened and did not blink. I told my story in a voice that was flat and cold and startling even to me. What came after was not the violent revenge the little dark half of me sometimes fantasized about. There were no dramatic murders, no delicious scenes of physical retribution. There was, instead, legal process, public exposure, and the slow demolition of a carefully curated life. I testified. I introduced other voices. Other people, survivors, teachers, the neighbor who had first called CPS, came forward. A pattern emerged from the fragments of our complaints: neglect, emotional abuse, manipulation, favoritism used as a tool of power. The law moved clumsily but inexorably. The church revoked her volunteer status. The PTA asked her to step down. Her friends started drifting away when they realized the friend they had loved in a choir photo had a secret ledger of cruelty no one wanted to be associated with. Her children did not fall to physical harm at my hands. They were tied to her by their own loyalties, by the same fog of normal that had kept me as a child. But what I did do, and what I regret even as I saw it happen, was tear away the gilded safety net she had built around them. Their schoolmates learned the truth because I testified at the hearing. The neighbors told their versions of the story in hushed tones. The stepmother's reputation dissolved into rumor and then into record. Jobs evaporated. Parents refused to share playdates. Her husband, my father, could not bear the shame and the truth that had for so long been soft-pedaled. We argued in courtrooms instead of at kitchen tables. He asked me once, in a corridor outside of a hearing, whether I had wanted this. I could not give him the answer he wanted. I did not relish his ruin, but the cost of silence had already been paid with too many small lives. Her children's lives changed, and they were not spared pain. They were forced to examine the house they had defended, the excuses they had learned to make. Some recoiled from me for exposing what they had believed. Some thanked me privately and then turned away. As the stepmother's social and legal supports vanished, the family structure that had maintained itself through intimidation began to crumble. Bills went unpaid when volunteer speaking engagements dried up. Friends stopped answering calls. My father, cornered by the truth and his own guilt, became a ghost of the man who had held me in one arm and pretended the other hand did not exist. I watched all of this from a peculiar distance, like someone looking at a beehive after a rock has been tossed in. The bees scattered and many were stung in the chaos. I spent nights that tasted like cheap wine and regret because I saw, finally, the full arc of what my defiance had done. I had wanted justice, safety, and in the getting of those things, people were harmed in ways I had not predicted. There were hearings. There were orders that removed her from household duties for a time. The children were placed with relatives and counselors. Some were angry, some were numb. One of them, the youngest, started wetting the bed again despite being in a supposedly safe space. Another dropped out of school, losing momentum the way you lose a thread when someone pulls at the wrong end. They were not disabled by my hands. They were disabled by the truth that had been kept from them so long it rendered them dizzy when it finally arrived. The collapse was not the neat, satisfying doom of fiction. It was ragged and human and full of small miseries. It is ugly to admit this, but I waited sometimes for a moment of catharsis I never found. People wanted a climax, a dramatic scene in which the stepmother fell from a cliff, screaming. Real life is more bureaucratic. Real revenge in my case took the shape of canceled memberships, court orders, and the slow erosion of social currency. The doom that descended upon them was less a theatrical punishment and more a slow unpegging from the world they had relied on. It felt, in the end, like justice to some, like cruelty to others. And there was another cost, my own self. The shadow I had escaped from had become my lens. Once her power, the performance, the smoke and mirrors, was stripped, I expected to feel lighter. Instead, I found myself hollowed. I could read a list of the injustices and feel the ring of correctness around each one. I could say, without lying, that I had acted to protect the vulnerable. But the nights I spent replaying old conversations, the times I saw my face in a window and did not recognize the person looking back, those were not things any verdict could fix. In the quiet aftermath, the town called a scandal, the tabloids called it tragedy, and the church called it a cautionary tale. My father moved away. He said he needs distance to breathe and to repair himself. The stepmother retreated into a smaller world that was thrice as lonely. Her children learned to navigate help groups and therapists and the long, humiliating process of grieving the life they thought they had. Some days they kicked against the help offered, as children do. Some days they moved forward. None of it was simple. Sometimes, late at night, I think of the shadow that followed me and how wrong I once was about escape. I had fancied that walking away with my bag would be enough, that freedom was a door you could close and lock. Instead, the shadow was a thing stitched into my bloodstream. It followed me into classrooms, into relationships, into the way I responded when someone placed their hand on mine. My revenge did not disable children the way a monster might in a story. It disabled a life of pretense. It collapsed the false gospel of the perfect household that had been propped up by a woman who preferred the performative benefits of motherhood to the messy, expensive work of love. In its place came a slow, painful unraveling. The result was ruin for many of those tied to her, sometimes deserved, sometimes collateral. You can call that doom. You can call it justice. For me, the line between them blurred long ago. Years later, I married a quiet man who knows how to hold hands without looking for claws. I am in therapy still. I teach, and I work with young people who live in houses that creak at night with secrets. I tell them, not as a sermon, but as a truth I learned too slowly, running away from a person is only the first step. The other steps are to learn to hear your own voice again, to hold it up when people try to erase you, and to help others without letting yourself become the very thing that broke you. The shadow keeps following. Sometimes it whispers that I was wrong, that I did this for vengeance, and that vengeance never heals. Other times it reminds me of the small girl who wanted only to belong. I answer now in more measured tones, that I chose to stop a pattern, not to become a monster. I won some things: safety, legal recognition, a life that does not smell of fear. I lost others: innocence, most of all, peace sometimes. If everyone ended up doomed, it was not because I wanted blood. It was because cruelty has a way of doing its own work. It creaks, then it breaks, and anyone inside that structure is likely to be bruised by the fall. The end I meted out was messy, necessary, and full of questions I still ask in the dark. The last scene is not one of triumphant laughter. It is an exhausted silence in which I sit with my own reflection and the knowledge that doing the right thing can still leave scars. Escaping was not the end. It never is. But it was the beginning of a life I am allowed to build, imperfect, stitched with regret, but mine. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, in atmosphere. The hum of fluorescent lights above me felt louder than my own breathing. Rows of polished wooden benches creaked under the weight of strangers, social workers, neighbors, and a few curious locals who had come to witness the downfall of the perfect woman they once admired. When I stepped into the witness box, my hands shook. I had imagined this moment 100 times in the silence of my tiny apartment. In my daydreams, I was strong, my voice sharp like a knife cutting through lies. In reality, my throat closed and my palms sweated. The bailiff swore me in. I raised my hand, promising truth, and for the first time in my life, I realized how terrifying the truth could be. The lawyer began with gentle questions. "Can you tell us about your home life after your father remarried?" I swallowed. My eyes flicked to her, my stepmom, sitting at the defense table. She wore her usual mask, tailored blazer, pearl earrings, hair pinned neatly. Her expression was calm, even pitying, as though she were the one enduring cruelty. She had perfected this act. It was different, I started carefully. When she came into our lives, she smiled in front of people. But behind closed doors, I hesitated. Behind closed doors, she was cruel. The room shifted. Pen scratched. Someone coughed. "What do you mean by cruel?" The lawyer pressed. The memories rose like bile. She'd call me useless. Remind me every day that I wasn't my mother's daughter anymore, that I was just dead weight my father carried. She would withhold meals, give everyone else food, and leave me scraps. Sometimes she'd lock me outside in the cold if I made a mistake. My voice cracked. She made me believe I wasn't human enough to deserve kindness. I heard a gasp from the gallery. I couldn't tell if it was disbelief or sympathy. The defense lawyer stood. Objection, hearsay, exaggeration, no evidence. But my lawyer had been ready. He raised a stack of reports, teachers' notes about my sudden weight loss, medical records about untreated bruises, CPS visits logged, and then mysteriously dismissed. Piece by piece, the documents landed like stones on a scale that had always been tilted in her favor. Then came the witnesses. A neighbor testified about hearing me cry outside late at night, barefoot in winter. A teacher admitted she'd suspected something but hadn't had proof. Even my half-brother, trembling and pale, admitted under questioning that things weren't right in the house, though he stopped short of condemning her outright. When it was her turn, she rose like a queen who'd been inconvenienced by peasants. Her voice was calm, sweet, measured. I loved her as my own. She was troubled, grieving her mother, and often misunderstood structure as punishment. I did my best. Her eyes slid toward me. For a second, just long enough for me to see, her mask cracked. She gave me the same look she had given me when I was 12, a look that said, "I still own you. Don't forget it." The judge noticed the way I stiffened. "Do you have something to say?" And that's when it poured out. The years of silence, the hidden bruises, the suffocating words. I told the court about the night CPS took me away and how, after 2 failed foster homes, I was handed back like unwanted luggage. I told them how she whispered in my ear during the fake hug, "You belong here. Don't ever forget it." The courtroom was silent when I finished. The judge leaned back, expression unreadable. Papers shuffled. The defense sputtered about rebellious teenagers and fabricated trauma. But it was too late. The mask had cracked, and the cracks were spreading. In that room, for the first time, I wasn't the unwanted child cowering under her shadow. I was the witness. The one with a voice. The one she couldn't silence. The verdict didn't arrive that day. Courts don't work like fairy tales. But something irreversible had happened. Her carefully crafted image was shattered. She could no longer hide behind pearl earrings and charity events. The community, her friends, even her children, they had heard the truth in my voice, raw and unpolished. When I stepped down from the witness stand, my legs shook so badly I thought I'd fall. But as I passed her, I didn't look away. For once, she did. And in that small, fragile moment, I realized I had finally become larger than her shadow. The verdict came weeks later. By then, the town buzzed with rumors. Neighbors whispered at grocery stores, church pews emptied around my stepmom, and invitations stopped arriving in her mailbox. She tried to keep her head high, but her smile had cracks, and for the first time, people noticed. On sentencing day, the courtroom was packed again. I sat in the front row, my hands clenched in my lap. My father was there too, sitting beside her, his face drawn and gray. He had stopped speaking to me after my testimony, unable to reconcile the woman he loved with the monster I described. But his silence spoke more than words. He knew. Deep down, he knew. The judge read the charges: emotional abuse, neglect, obstruction during CPS investigations. Nothing as cinematic as I once imagined. No lifetime sentence. But still, accountability. She was stripped of guardianship, banned from volunteering with children, ordered into counseling, fined, and placed under probation with regular monitoring. The court didn't take her to prison, but they took away the mask she had worn for years. And that was its own kind of cage. Her children were placed in the care of relatives. For them, the sentence was confusing, even cruel. They had to live with the truth that their mother wasn't who they thought she was. Some defended her fiercely. Others crumbled under the weight of betrayal. At school, classmates whispered. Teachers watched them with pity. The family name, once respected, now carried the stain of scandal. My father moved out of town shortly after. I saw him one last time in the courthouse parking lot. He looked at me, his eyes full of guilt, but he said nothing. Not an apology, not a goodbye. Just silence, the same silence he had wrapped himself in for years while I suffered under her roof. He climbed into his car and drove away. For her, life became smaller. Friends abandoned her. The PTA barred her. The church asked her to step down from every committee. The world she once ruled with a smile and sharpened tongue collapsed. She lived in the same house, but it was no longer a home. It was a tomb of echoes, where every room reminded her of what she had lost. As for me, I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought the verdict would erase her voice from my head. But healing doesn't happen with a gavel strike. Her shadow still lingered, whispering doubts in quiet moments. You're a liar. You ruined a family. You'll never be free of me. And yet, something had changed. The difference was that now, the world had heard my truth. I was no longer screaming into a void. The cage she built around me had been broken, even if the bars still pressed against my skin in memory. Over time, I built a life beyond her. Therapy, friends who became family, a partner who understood my scars without trying to fix them. I learned to cook meals for myself without waiting for scraps. I learned to sleep without fear of footsteps in the hallway. But the doom she created didn't vanish. It spread slowly, inevitably, to everyone who once lived under her roof. Her children carried shame they didn't earn. My father lived with regret that hollowed him out. And she herself, stripped of power, faded into someone unrecognizable. In the end, her cruelty destroyed more than just me. It poisoned everything she touched, until all that was left was ruin. That was the true doom. Not fire, not blood, but the slow, merciless collapse of a woman who built her kingdom on control and cruelty. And me? I walked away from the ashes, still scarred, still shadowed, but free. 10 years passed. Long enough for scars to fade into faint lines, but never long enough for memory to loosen its grip. By then, I had built a life of my own. I worked with children in the foster system, kids who carried the same shadows I once did. Every time I sat across from them, I recognized the haunted look in their eyes, the constant waiting for kindness to turn into cruelty. I never lied to them by saying it gets better quickly. Instead, I told them the truth. Healing is slow, messy, and uneven, but it's possible. One autumn evening, as the leaves browned and the air turned sharp, I heard news of her. My stepmom. She was living alone now. Her children had grown and left, some moved across the country, some cut ties completely. My father had remarried and disappeared into another state, never once reaching out. Friends no longer called. The church, the committees, the neighbors who once praised her had long since moved on. I was told she'd grown ill. Nothing dramatic, just the quiet cruelty of age and loneliness. She struggled with her health, shuffled down empty hallways in the same house where she once reigned. The walls, they said, echoed with silence, a silence she could no longer command. For a moment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction. Justice, I thought. But then something else came, heavier, stranger, pity. Because in the end, she had built her entire life on cruelty and appearances, and when those things crumbled, she had nothing left. No real love. No genuine bond. No one to hold her hand in her last years. She had doomed herself. I never visited. I never called. She was a ghost long before death claimed her, haunting her own empty kingdom. As for me, I finally found peace not in her downfall, but in my survival. In the fact that I walked away from the house that tried to consume me. In the family I built not by blood, but by choice. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, her shadow still flickers at the edge of my mind. But it no longer commands me. It no longer defines me. Because I learned something she never did, cruelty leaves nothing behind but ruin. But love, the kind I learned to grow in myself and give to others, leaves light. And light is the only thing that truly ends a shadow.